The first word in both the title and the text is before, before which we might tarry a moment. Is before a temporal or a spatial preposition? Before begins a phrase that shows where a doorkeeper stands. A doorkeeper stands in front of the law. Thus, the preposition seems spatial. But how can something or someone stand in front of the law? Is not a law a set of rules, or might a law be its enforcement? In other words, like a police station. Or might a law be a book, wherein the laws, plural, are written? But then how to read this book, interpret the signs? Is not a special knowledge required? Might the law, then, be not only the book wherein it's writ, but also that art of telling the signs, of reading whither these refer? The preposition before begins to lay out the setting, a setting perhaps metaphorical. Its purpose to show the difficulty in reaching the law, a problem perplexing a man from the country. That a doorkeeper stands before the door, and a man from the country prays for admittance, suggests that the difficulty confronting this man from the country represents the human condition. That mankind has, in modern times at least, lost access to the law. Mankind has not only forgotten what the law is, but also how to ask about it. That the man who prays for admittance is from the country suggests he has set out on a journey. What kind of journey is this? Perhaps a journey that symbolizes the life of a man, or even a journey that symbolizes the quest for enlightenment. Perhaps the plot in this setting shows a mental movement, or an attempt, a movement from ignorance to enlightenment, or from ignorance to a deeper knowledge of its depth. What is the law? Our guessing earlier aside, let us note that in the English translation, the word is capitalized. Might law thus have a theological connotation? Indeed, the man from the country prays for admittance. The man from the country prays for admittance to this law. But by these signs, Kafka suggests really an esoteric kind of knowledge, whatever it be, that in this modern time has fallen into default. And let's move on to ask some questions about the doorkeeper as well. Who or what is he? What does he represent? This is a parable, after all. It's going to be highly symbolic. If the man prays to the doorkeeper for admittance, might the doorkeeper be some kind of emissary between man and the law? In theological terms, might he be a being like an angel? But this being, whatever he be, blocks the man, mocks him, blocks him, and he mocks him. Might he thus a demon be? Or do the difficulties reside in the man, in his misconceptions of what is the law, how to ask about this law? What do we know about the man? He is one who thinks it over, who asks. But interestingly, he does not ask why he is denied access now. He trusts that the doorkeeper has a reason, but rather than inquire into this reason, if the doorkeeper have any, the man asks whether access will be granted later. The man is one who thinks it over and asks, but he is also one who stoops to peer. He bends down, he stoops to peer, and peers looking. He stoops to peer through the gateway into the interior. To peer is to look, to gather knowledge through the eyes. That the man stoops shows that he is, at present, much taller than another man who would have passed through that gateway. And perhaps this likens the law unto an ancient building of the kind recovered by archaeology. In addition, that the man stoops suggests that he stands taller than that of which he seeks knowledge. He stands over what he would like to know, as though he's in a position of false mastery. There's a detail that's revealed later in the parable, that the difference in height between the man and the doorkeeper has altered much to the doorkeeper's advantage and the man's disadvantage. If you just read that and you forget this previous detail, that the difference in height has altered seems to have no precedence whatsoever, but it's implicit in the fact that the man stoops. So you have to assume that the doorkeeper, who is some kind of representative of the law, if he's not some malicious demon, that he is of the right height to pass through the gateway. That the doorkeeper laughs suggests that the man's predicament is absurd. And this is where we start tossing around that commonly used word to describe everything that's Kafka or Kafkaesque. It's absurd, or the French theater, Camus. It's absurd, l'absurdité, or whatever. Does the man assume that a clear protocol governs access to the law? And does this assumption deter him from any risk, any illegal act to know the law? I know that sounds contradictory, but it is absurd. For, we are told, the gate stands open, as usual. Why not just run through? But of course the man is he's told indirectly about the third doorkeeper. He's never actually seen him, so he's trusting a second-hand report from the first doorkeeper. So I've said elsewhere that he gathers evidence through his eyes, but this is a case where he's not even verifying. Another side note, we've been talking about the human condition, so when the doorkeeper says, he describes the man from the country saying, "Oh, you are drawn to the law," if you're so drawn to it. He doesn't name it explicitly, but if you were so drawn to it. This is also another statement about the human condition, and it may be a theological statement as well, about the nature of man with respect to the lawmaker. Moving on. The first doorkeeper says he cannot bear to look upon the third. The man does not verify. The first doorkeeper says he cannot bear to look. I'm looking at the verbs now. Look, the eyes, upon the third. And at the first doorkeeper, the man from the country takes a closer look. Same verb again, in the noun form. Look as a noun. In the German, I don't have the German in front of me, but it might be Ausschein, which suggests an exterior, a surface. So he's basing his deductions upon superficial information, or things he hasn't even seen at all, like the third doorkeeper. To reiterate the overall question of this parable, is the man's predicament merely the absurdity of the law, the arbitrary access that's allowed or not allowed, or is the flaw, as though this were some kind of tragedy, but is the flaw in his reasoning, in his modes of thinking, gathering information? In plain English, is he thinking too normally, or in a way that's too modern and cut off from tradition? So the man, he takes a closer look, and then he confirms his inaction. He said, "Oh, it's going to be better to wait until I get permission." Yep, better to wait. Of course. So the man from the country, but he's sympathetic. He's not an annoying modern person as well. That's intolerably legalistic. No, he can't be. That's the law. He doesn't know the law. The man from the country is one who thinks it over, peers, and now looks. He gathers evidence with his eyes. He learns through the senses. He assumes things of the law that may be contrary to its nature. Firstly, that it ought to be accessible at all times. And secondly, ought to be accessible to everyone. Is that some kind of political statement? So is the main obstacle between the man and the law really the doorkeeper? Or how this man, how he learns and how he thinks? If I quote the text exactly, you'll see that the law, you'll hear, the law, he thinks, should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone. The word surely, S-U-R-E-L-Y, the word surely in Kafka's short stories is almost always a red flag. It indicates that the protagonist is thinking way too normally. It's a joke. If you read the introduction in this book, whatever story is set on, John Updike, whatever, but he reports that when Kafka would read his stories, he would frequently just burst into laughter and he'd be unable to finish. And these jokes aren't inside jokes. You pick up on it once you read 5, 6. And also the phrase "without a doubt." It's usually screaming the same thing, that the protagonist is going down the complete wrong road. Now, going back to the law. So the law should surely be accessible at all times. This is a temporal phrase, so take note that it contradicts the earlier antithesis between at the moment and later. And at the very opening of the parable, for example, the doorkeeper says that he cannot grant admittance at the moment. And the man doesn't ask why. He doesn't ask why. He just says, well, how about later? And to go back to that, the law, he thinks, should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone. So when the man from the country, when he thinks this, is he articulating a well-thought-out political position? Or does he echo a natural opinion without seriously considering the opposite? Is he joking about modern man and how he thinks politically that, oh, this should just be so, and he doesn't even bother considering the opposite, perhaps because it's too absurd? Yeah, dig a bit deeper and to really pick this apart. So one of the key phrases in the parable, the law, he thinks, should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone. At all times, that's the time dimension, that's the when, in terms of English question words. And the to everyone, that concerns the who or the to whom. Because the man assumes that when he prays for admittance should not matter. Whether or not the stars are in alignment in the night sky is completely irrelevant. The man also assumes that who prays for admittance does not matter. So no natural, if I may use the word, no natural hierarchy prevails among mankind. There are no just natural tiers of this type, like man and Superman, for example. And he also assumes that no esoteric order. He's assuming that he can just go straight in. He doesn't have to gain entrance into a priesthood, for example, and go to a seminary for training. In the Old Testament, the prophets are always called by God. You have to have that inspiration. Even Montaigne, the Pyrrhonist, he said that man cannot know anything except through divine inspiration. The man sits on a stool by the door for days and years. This leap in time suggests that this waiting by the gateway is of an archetypal nature, that the human condition as a whole is one of waiting for readmittance to this law. That man expects to reacquire this knowledge, but by means foreign to it. In other words, he thinks, oh yeah, we're entitled to this knowledge. We're gonna acquire it or get it back if we lost it. It doesn't say that we lost it in this parable, but if you read the Hundred Gracchus, You get that impression pretty strongly. His methods of inquiry may well be foreign, completely orthogonal to the essence of the law. But this kind of interpretation, I say, may also be a leap. But nonetheless, a phrase like this for days and years, this is something that calls for thought. By speculating on the meaning of it, I'm also asking, what does it mean? Eventually, the man who has furnished himself with many things sacrifices all he has. Ordinarily, this phrase signifies the renunciation of materialism. However, the man from the country, he assumes the doorkeeper, who is a representative of the law, perhaps, he's assuming that the doorkeeper actually values these things because he bribes the doorkeeper. Moreover, the narrator, third-person narrator or something, he's also in the head of the of the protagonist, the man from the country. It's kind of mimicking or subtly mocking, but also his thought process, but also pitying him as well. No doubt, a lot of sympathy for this modern man. The narrator glibly and deliberately bandies about the phrases, many other things, everything, anything. So, and these are usually signposts for nothing, honestly. The narration mimics the naive thought process of the man who waits for permission, the man who thinks it over, peers, looks, but who admittedly also prays. Now a deeper dive into this. In the phrase, the doorkeeper accepts everything, the everything is glaringly it's not everything, okay? It's a joke. The doorkeeper accepts everything. It's everything that the man is able to think of to give him. It's not everything that the man could possibly do to gain access to the law, but it's everything within his limited universe. And same with the word anything, and to keep you from thinking you have omitted anything. It's a joke. It's as though the thinking of the man were restricted to rational thought. Thus, his anything, what's anything for him, is really but a figment of the universe, if not nothing at all. Nonetheless, the man who first prays, and this is the first verb associated with him. I've characterized him above as someone who peers, looks, thinks it over. Überlegen auf Deutsch. It's probably what's there, I don't know. The first verb associated with him is that he prays. So the question is, did he stop praying? Did he pray at one time in the past and then cease? Is this a metaphor for human history? That man once prayed? Because it occurs so early in the not the novel, but the parable, and then it ceases. It ceases thereafter. But he attains a glimmer of awareness at the end. Nonetheless, the man who first prays also forgets. And we see the word forgets. He forgets the other doorkeepers right there. He forgets the other doorkeepers. It's as though if he acquires any new knowledge, it's at the expense of wisdom, or knowledge, really, of knowledge he once had. Just as he peers and takes a closer look earlier, so now he fixes his attention on the doorkeeper, and thus he may be confusing the obstacle between him and his goal, for the goal itself. His goal is to know the law. Totally fixated on that one doorkeeper of many. If you picture this like an onion, it's like the outer layer. He curses his bad luck. Yeah, it's just bad luck. However, might the cause of the man's inability to access the law also reside in his expectations thereof? The cause is in how he thinks, how he perceives, to use a modern word. Even though thinking in terms of cause and effect is ordinarily rational, at least in terms of the motion of objects, and every event that occurs in the universe is just a sum of motions of particles and whatever. So, does the contemplation that comes to know even the fleas, does this resemble the knowledge of science or scholarship? Very precise, gathering many specimens. As we've said, that the man from the country knows mostly by vision signifies also that he reasons, perhaps in a way that's too normal. And that his eyesight begins to fail also signifies that reason starts failing. Or, I think this is better, that reason begins to give way to a more authentic form of thinking. By authentic, I mean it involves the whole of his being, not just his head or his consciousness, a small part of the head, right? All his experiences gather themselves to one point. So, at this point in the parable, his experiences or his memories are independently computing not an answer, but a question to ask, one final question to pose to the doorkeeper. And you could say, well, that his unconscious mind is starting to work. I mean, I don't want to get caught up in modern phrases in a parable that is questioning whether humanity in modern times is heading down the right road at all. Probably the most important lines in the parable are, "At length his eyesight begins to fail, and he does not know whether the world is really darker, or whether his eyes are only deceiving him. Yet, in his darkness, he is now aware of a radiance that streams inextinguishably from the gateway of the law." The man who once peered and took a closer look does not know. This is where we'll talk a little bit about the technique of gathering data, I guess, towards interpretation. I call this method of picking out key phrases substring, because it's not the full string, it's a substring. It's a term from computer science. Now, and the substring that I have in mind is does not know. I just picked that right out of the sentence. That's a verb. It's 3 words, but it forms one verb to now be associated with the man. And it's a big shift, because before he prays or he peers or he decides or whatever, besides that praying at the opening of the parable, he's just thinking, seeing, and implicitly also trusting the doorkeeper, but not trusting. He's trusting the doorkeeper has a reason for not letting him in, but he doesn't even ask. In politics, this is called quoting out of context, but in interpretation, it helps bring into relief those details or those words and phrases that best exemplify the message. By this substring technique, you can pick out does not know and add it to the category of verbs. So, in other words, the category is just a list. You know what to collect. Like you have a dashboard that you related to this parallel. I want to collect verbs that the man does, or adjectives that describe the doorkeeper, for instance, or the third doorkeeper. Seemingly arbitrary things to collect. Remember, you don't just want to be reading and, this is important, we can underline it, or whatever. You could be more precise in your methodology of interpretation, or this is a helpful hermeneutic. You can pick out does not know and add it to the category of verbs associated with the man. Or if it's not a category, it's an ordered list. By so categorizing, if you do this categorizing, then you can see across, it's a compound, see across all things or all words or phrases that fall into that category. And then you can compare them, because say one of them that's significant is here, another is, over here. You might lose sight of it as you read. Our purview is, it's very, very restricted. What's present to you at this time in history, your routine at the house where you live, and we tend to forget all of our previous dwellings, whether they're jobs, offices, or your alma mater, education, and so on. These things, they fall off, and we act as though this individual existence is just going to go on forever when we're in a routine. It becomes an archetypal repeated day. Between each day, minute differences prevail. You can see across all words or phrases that fall into the category, and then you can compare them. And it sounds very obvious, but it's not. An additional substring that packs a lot of meaning is in the darkness. He is now aware. When the inner light, or the obscuring light of reason, like a light bulb. In an urban metropolis, you can't see the light of the stars because the light bulbs are on constantly. When the inner light of reason is nearly extinguished, can this man from the country see the light of the law? He does not know whether the world is really darker, or whether his eyes are only deceiving him. He begins to doubt. We have this verb does not know associated now, or dropped off in that category of verbs associated with the man from the country. You could also add doubt to that list. So firstly, he doubts the reliability of the sense organs, or symbolically of reason. And secondly, and as a consequence of the first, he begins to doubt whether his knowledge is merely in his head or in the things themselves. So just like René Descartes, he has begun to wonder whether the knowledge he has of things is real or merely ideal, or whether it's objective or merely subjective. This is a step forward, this great progress. So Descartes, however, founded modern philosophy, which laid the foundation of modern science. So is that going to be useful towards knowledge of the law? Is it really a step forward? Yes, it's a step forward, but is it the decisive step forward, or the first of many? So in this sentence, the man considers only the world and his eyes, but never the law. Has he taken a step forward, only to fall into another trap? Say you got past the first doorkeeper, maybe he's now cowering before the second, or just, metaphorically immobilized. We don't know. You'll see in a lot of Kafka stories that you fall from one trap into another. You start thinking too normally, and then you go to the total opposite. You start thinking utterly absurdly, and that also doesn't help you to attain the law. The law has to be orderly and has to have some kind of rationality, but not that rationality. Not the kind of rationality that thinks it's the only thing in the world, stops even talking about its opposition. It just thinks that what it wants the world to be like is exactly how the world is. This is what's human. This is what is. This is what's real. If you disagree, then you're not human. So, nonetheless, the man from the country finally sees the radiance that streams inextinguishably from the gateway of the law. Nope. That's a mistake. Does he actually see this radiance? No. The narrator tells us he is aware of it, but not necessarily through his eyes. His consciousness is directly accessing this. In Platonic terms, it's as though through thinking he's directly accessing the ideas of which things of the senses are faded copies, utterly faded copies, almost unfaithful representations. But the mind goes straight to the ideas, which are nowhere and everywhere, never, but also eternal. I think it's a detour it's worth taking. The narrator does not speak of the radiance streaming inextinguishably, but rather a radiance. What effect does this choice have? Lone positive detail of the law provided to us. This requires further inquiry. It's vaguer. It's some kind of radiance. Is it really a radiance or something like a radiance? The doorkeeper bends low to answer the man's final question. He roars in his ear. That's a detail worth noticing. In Kafka's short stories, this direct mouth-to-ear communication, mostly in whispers, not in this case, but he's roaring, it usually signifies meaningful communication, in contradistinction to little interviews, as we see on the other page. And this kind of communication, it's a motif. I haven't used the word motif yet. It is a motif. It indicates so-called turning points in both the plot and the symbolic plot. Now, if you read an imperial message, which is the next parable, you'll see that the parable begins with whispers between the emperor and the messenger. I've thrown around the word absurd a little bit. We're gonna throw it around again. The gate is for the man from the country, and him alone, yet he isn't allowed to go through. I don't know how else to describe that. It's absurd. It seems contradictory. It's for him, but yet he can't go through. Is the law absurd? Is that the problem? Or is reason, in its present form, incapable of comprehending absurdity? What we're calling absurdity as modern readers in this modern time, what we're calling absurdity is that simply a denigration of a higher order that our limited order cannot access. In the future, I plan to do a reading and also interpretation of the next parable, an imperial message. I've alluded to it a few times. To summarize the plots as well. So in this parable, before the law, you, or the man from the country, let's say it's you. In this one, you're trying to reach the law. In the next parable, an imperial message, the law is trying to reach you. But it's also obstructed. Why is that? Let's find out next time.